In the fall of 2008, when the price of diesel fuel peaked at $4.84 a gallon in Lincoln County, Elara Bishop's 120-acre farm was the only one in a three-county radius to turn a meaningful profit. It wasn't because of a government subsidy, a clever futures contract, or some miraculous new hybrid seed. It was because of two Belgian draft horses named Jed and Maeve, and a promise she had made to her grandfather 30 years prior. The fuel bill for Bishop Farm that year, for all tillage, planting, and harvesting transport, was exactly $0.00. Then, as always, the story rewinds. Let me tell you about the land, because that is where the story begins. The 120 acres that would become Bishop Farm were purchased in March of 1946 by Elara's grandfather, Thomas Bishop. He was 28 years old, had served for 3 years in the Pacific with the Navy Seabees, and had returned with $1,782 in savings and a deep, abiding distrust of complex machinery that failed at critical moments. The land was considered marginal. It sat in a shallow bowl of the rolling hills, 5 miles down a gravel road named for a family that had gone bankrupt and left in the Depression. The previous owner had tried to make a living on cotton for 15 years, and the soil was thin, acidic, and tired. Thomas paid $4,200 for the tract, a price that represented $35 an acre, putting down his entire savings and taking a loan for the remaining $2,418 from the local bank in Millersburg, a loan he was determined to pay off in 5 years, not the 10 he was offered. He did not buy a tractor. In 1946, that was not an unusual decision. While the first wave of Fordson and Farmall tractors had arrived, many small farms still depended on animal power. Thomas used the last of his wife's savings to purchase a pair of young Percheron mares and a set of used harnesses from a farmer who was upgrading to a brand new Alice Chalmers Model C. He paid $300 for the pair. He spent the first year not planting a cash crop. This was his first act of quiet rebellion against the conventional wisdom of the time. His neighbors, eager to cash in on post-war grain prices, plowed fence row to fence row. Thomas spent a year turning his farm into a closed loop. He planted 40 acres in clover and alfalfa. He used the horses to haul limestone from the county quarry, 11 tons of it, spread by hand with a shovel from the back of a wooden wagon. He hauled every scrap of manure from the barn and the pasture and worked it into the exhausted cotton fields. He had a set of rules, spoken rarely but practiced daily. Rule 1. The farm must first feed itself. Before a single bushel was sold, the farm had to produce everything needed for the family and the livestock. That meant a 2-acre garden, a milk cow, chickens, and 20 acres of oats and 20 acres of hay for the horses. The cash crop, which in his case was corn and later soybeans, was planted on the remaining acres. Only the surplus was for sale. Rule 2. The farm must not depend on a bill that comes in the mail. This was the core of his philosophy. A man who owes the bank for his land, the oil company for his fuel, and the chemical company for his fertilizer is not a farmer, he would say. He is a tenant on his own property. He paid off the bank loan in 4 years and 11 months. On the day he made the final payment of $48.36, he walked out of the bank, drove his wagon home, and burned the loan papers in the kitchen stove. Elara was born in 1950, the year her grandfather celebrated his freedom from debt. She grew up in the rhythm of the horses. She didn't learn about farming from a book. She learned it from the feel of the reins in her hands, the smell of warm leather and horse sweat, the sound of the plowshare slicing through the dark, recovering soil. By the time she was 10, her grandfather's fields were visibly different from the neighbors'. His soil was darker, held water longer after a rain, and crumbled in the hand. The neighbors' fields were paler, harder, and shed water in muddy torrents into the county ditches. Let me tell you about the arrival of the machine, because it was the first great test. The 1950s and 60s were the golden age of mechanization. John Deere green and International Harvester red became the colors of progress. The sound of the countryside changed, from the quiet jingle of harness and the soft footfalls of horses to the roar of diesel engines. By 1965, Thomas Bishop's farm was an island. He was the only farmer in Lincoln County still using horses for primary tillage. His neighbors were buying bigger and bigger equipment. They could plow an 80-acre field in a day. Thomas and his Belgians, he had switched to the heavier breed in 1958 for their steady temperament, took a week. The pressure was immense. It came from the co-op, where the manager talked endlessly about yields per hour, not just yields per acre. It came from the salesman who drove out uninvited in new sedans, leaving glossy brochures on the porch. It came from his neighbors, who spoke with a kind of pity. "Tom, you're working yourself to death," said his closest neighbor, Frank Miller, who had just mortgaged his own farm to buy a new John Deere 4020 for $8,900. "This machine does the work of 10 horses. Thomas would just nod. He'd look at Frank's new tractor, then at his own fields. He'd do the math in his head. The tractor cost $8,900. That was more than twice what he'd paid for his entire farm. It required diesel fuel, which cost 28 cents a gallon. It required specialized parts, mechanics, and expensive rubber tires. And it created debt. His horses, Jed and Maeve's predecessors, required oats and hay, which he grew himself. They required harness, which he could mend with his own hands. They produced fertilizer, which enriched his soil, and they were paid for. He watched as Frank Miller, to service the debt on the 4020, had to plant more and more acres of corn, abandoning crop rotation. He had to buy nitrogen fertilizer from the co-op because he no longer had a steady supply of manure. Within 5 years, Frank's input costs had tripled. His yields went up, yes, but his profits were thinner than ever. Then, in the fall of 1971, the transmission on the 4020 failed. The repair bill was $1,200. Frank had to take out another loan. Elara, then 21, watched all of this. She had just finished a 2-year agricultural science program at the local community college, where every single textbook presumed the use of tractors and chemical inputs. Her professors had called animal traction a historical curiosity. She came home conflicted, half believing the gospel of modern efficiency. One evening, she tried to argue with her grandfather. "The books say we could increase our yield by 15% with a tractor and anhydrous ammonia," she said, holding a textbook open on the worn oak kitchen table. Thomas, then 53, was cleaning a piece of harness with saddle soap. He didn't look up from his work. He worked the soap into the leather with slow, circular motions. The smell of it filled the room. Finally, he spoke. He said, "They're not measuring the right things. They measure the yield of the crop. They don't measure the health of the soil. They measure the speed of the planting. They don't measure the cost of the speed. They measure the profit in a good year. They don't measure the loss in a bad one." He put down the harness and looked at her. His hands were thick and calloused, but they were gentle with the leather. He said, "This farm is not a factory, Elara. It's a living thing. The goal isn't to get the most out of it in 1 year. The goal is for it to be here in 100 years. That was the year he bought a new set of harness from an Amish craftsman in Pennsylvania. It cost $800, a significant sum, but he explained it to Elara as an investment, not an expense. "This leather, if we care for it, will outlast me," he said. "A tractor engine will not." He made her promise that as long as the farm was in her name, there would be horses on it, not as pets, but as partners. She promised. It was a promise that, for the next 25 years, would seem less like wisdom and more like a burden. Thomas Bishop passed away in the winter of 1978. He died at 60, in his own bed, looking out the window at the snow-covered pasture where the horses stood, their breath pluming in the cold air. He left the farm, free and clear, to Elara. She was 28 years old, had farmed the same 120 acres her entire life, and was now known for 2 things: her silence and her grandfather's horses. The farm was solvent. It had 0 debt. The soil organic matter was at 6.2%, compared to the county average of 2.8%. But in the eyes of the world, she was running a museum. The 1980s were brutal. Commodity prices cratered, Interest rates soared. The farm crisis swept through the Midwest, foreclosing on generations of accumulated wealth. Frank Miller, Elara's neighbour, lost his farm in 1985. The bank that had loaned him money for the 4020 and two subsequent larger tractors sold his 300 acres at auction. It was bought by a corporate aggregator from out of state. Elara survived. She survived because her costs were fixed and minimal. The price of corn could fall to $1.50 a bushel and she would still be okay. Her cost of production was under $1 a bushel. Her neighbours, with their massive machinery loans and high input costs, needed $2.50 just to break even. She watched as 5 families on her road lost their farms. Their fields were consolidated into a single 2,000-acre monoculture operation managed by a man in a pickup truck who lived 40 miles away. The farmhouses were bulldozed. Still, the logic of the age was unassailable. Bigger was better. Faster was smarter. Elara's quiet solvency was invisible. What the world saw was a woman in her 30s and 40s doing back-breaking work with antiquated tools, while her peers were riding in air-conditioned cabs listening to the radio. Her nephew Leo, born in 1988, was embarrassed. When his friends from school would drive by, they'd see his aunt walking behind a team of massive horses. They'd laugh. "Is your aunt Amish?" they'd ask. Leo would pretend he didn't hear them. He loved his aunt, but he wished she would just buy a tractor like everyone else. This brings us to the spring of 2007. The world was booming. Commodity prices were climbing to historic highs, driven by the new ethanol mandate and global demand. The price of corn was flirting with $4 a bushel. Farmland prices were soaring, and the price of diesel fuel was beginning its steady, relentless climb. It was $2.70 a gallon and rising. In this environment of boundless optimism, a new character entered Elara's life. His name was Mark Renslow. Mark Renslow was 32 years old, had an MBA from the State University, had been an agricultural loan officer for 4 years, and was known for his confidence. He represented the Regional Agricultural Bank, the successor to the small town bank that had loaned Thomas Bishop money 60 years prior. Mark was not a villain. He was a product of his time, a true believer in data, efficiency, and leveraged growth. He saw Elara's farm on a county plat map, a 120-acre anomaly surrounded by mega-farms. He saw her tax records, which showed consistent, tiny profits. He saw an opportunity. Not for him, he thought, but for her. He saw an underperforming asset. He drove his clean, white Ford Fusion down her gravel road on a Tuesday in May. Elara, now 57, was in the front pasture with Jed and Maeve, the great-great-grandchildren of the original Belgian pair. She was cultivating a field of young corn, the cultivator a 70-year-old piece of steel she maintained herself. Mark parked his car and walked to the fence line. He watched for a few minutes. He saw a woman walking slowly, the lines in her hands, the sun on her neck. He saw 2 enormous animals, a cloud of dust, and a process that was achingly, inefficiently slow. He called out to her. She finished her row, turned the team around with a quiet word, and walked them over to the fence. The horses stood breathing heavily, their coats gleaming with sweat. Elara just looked at him, her eyes shaded by the brim of a worn straw hat. Mark introduced himself. He was smooth, polite, professional. He had a binder with him. "Miss Bishop," he began, "I'm Mark Renslow from Ag Credit Bank. I was looking at the operations in this area, and I believe there's a significant opportunity for you to increase your profitability." Elara said nothing. She ran a hand along Maeve's neck. Mark opened his binder. It was full of charts, spreadsheets, and glossy photos of new equipment. "Your 120 acres, with current corn prices, has a potential gross revenue of over $70,000, he said. "But your current methods are, well, they're leaving a lot of that potential on the table. We've run the numbers." Let me tell you about his numbers. They were beautiful. They were printed in color. He had a projection showing the cost-benefit analysis of purchasing a new John Deere 6430 tractor, which cost $95,000, along with a new 6-row planter and a 15-foot chisel plow. Total equipment loan, $145,000. He had a spreadsheet that calculated the time savings. Plowing all 100 of her crop acres would take 3 days, not 3 weeks. Planting would take 1 day, not 5. He had factored in the cost of fuel, projecting an annual expense of $4,500 based on diesel at $2.75 a gallon. He showed her the bottom line. After loan payments, fuel, and maintenance, her net profit could, according to his projections, increase from its current average of $8,000 a year to over $30,000 a year. He said, "This is about working smarter, not harder. It's about leveraging your assets to maximize returns." Elara finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, unused to long conversations. She said, "My assets are my soil and my horses. A loan is not an asset, it is a liability." Mark smiled, a patient, condescending smile. He said, "It's called good debt, Elara. It's debt that generates income. You're thinking like it's 1950. The modern farmer has to be a savvy financial manager." She looked from his shiny shoes to his clean hands, then to his binder. She pointed a finger at the fuel cost projection, a single line item for $4,500. "And what if the price of fuel is not $2.75, she asked. Mark shrugged. "It might fluctuate a little, sure, but energy prices have been stable for years. It's a manageable variable. Our models account for a 10 to 15% variance." She looked at her horses. Jed and Maeve ate oats and hay. The price of oats had been stable for 50 years because the price of oats was tied to the land, not to a geopolitical crisis a world away. She grew her own fuel. The cost was a fixed amount of her own labor. Mark's fuel came from a pipeline that stretched across the globe, vulnerable to hurricanes, wars, and speculators in Chicago and New York. He kept talking. He spoke of GPS guidance, of variable rate fertilizer application, of genetically modified seeds that were resistant to the herbicides she would need to use with no-till planting. He was painting a picture of a clean, efficient, profitable future. She cut him off. Her voice was still quiet, but it had a new edge. "Mr. Renslow," she said, "my grandfather taught me that a farmer who cannot farm without a loan is not a farmer. He is an employee of the bank. You are asking me to fire myself and hire you." Mark was taken aback. He said, "That's not what I'm asking. I'm offering you a tool, a partnership." Elara shook her head. She picked up the leather reins. "You are selling a system that is fast, expensive, and fragile. I am running a system that is slow, cheap, and durable. I will stick with durable." She clucked to the horses, and the team moved away, leaving Mark Renslow standing in the fence line with his binder of beautiful, irrelevant numbers. He didn't give up. He came back twice more that summer. He tried to talk to her nephew Leo, who was 19 and home from his first year of college. Leo listened intently. Mark's talk of profit and modern technology made sense to him. He argued with Elara. "Aunt Elara, he's right. You're working this hard for $8,000 a year? It's crazy." Elara was mending a tear in a canvas seed bag, one her grandfather had used. The bag was 50 years old. She was stitching it with a needle and wax thread. She said, "Leo, that $8,000 is real. It's mine. The $30,000 Mr. Renslow is promising is imaginary. It belongs to the bank, the oil company, and the tractor dealership. Before I would see a penny of it, all of them would have to be paid first. In a good year, maybe there's something left over. In a bad year, you lose the farm. We don't have bad years." Leo threw up his hands in frustration. He didn't understand. The entire world was telling him that his aunt was a fool, a relic. The year 2007 turned into 2008. The price of corn hit $5, then $6. The price of soybeans followed. Farmers with large leveraged operations were making fortunes on paper. The price of farmland in Lincoln County jumped 30% in 1 year. Mark Renslow was a hero at his bank, having written millions in new equipment loans. And the price of diesel fuel continued its climb. It hit $3 in the winter. By spring planting in 2008, it was $3.80. By early summer, it crossed the $4 mark. The mood in the county began to shift. The talk at the co-op changed. The initial euphoria about high grain prices was replaced by a nervous muttering about input costs. The farmers who had followed Mark Renslow's advice were now paying not $4,500 a year for fuel, but $8,000, then $10,000. Fertilizer prices, tied to the price of natural gas, had doubled. Their break-even point, which had been $2.50 a bushel for corn, was now over $4. The margin of error was vanishing. Elara kept farming. She rose before the sun. She fed Jed and Maeve. She harnessed them. She walked her fields. The rhythm of her days was the same in 2008 as it had been in 1978. The only difference was the number on the sign at the gas station in town, a number that had no bearing on her life. Her cost of production for a bushel of corn was still under $1. It was the cost of her own labor, the seed she saved from the previous year, and the oats she fed her horses. Everything else was a closed loop. The sun, the soil, the rain, the horses. The climax was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, slow-motion event that unfolded across the fall of 2008. In September, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The global financial system seized up. Credit markets froze. Commodity prices, which had been propped up by speculative investment, plummeted. In the space of 6 weeks, the price of corn fell from over $7 a bushel to under $3.50. This was the decisive moment. For the leveraged farmers, it was a catastrophe. They had bought fertilizer and fuel when prices were at their peak, expecting to sell their grain for record highs. Now, they were facing a market that was below their cost of production. A farmer with 2,000 acres who had input costs of $4 a bushel was now looking at selling his crop for $3.50. He was looking at a loss of over $100,000. He had loan payments to make. The bank, which had been so eager to lend him money a year before, was now calling, its own survival in question. For Elara Bishop, the fall in corn prices was a disappointment, not a disaster. She had 8,000 bushels of corn to sell from her 80 acres of cash crop. At $7, she would have made a handsome profit. At $3.50, she would still make a profit. Her total out-of-pocket cost to produce that corn was around $7,200. Her revenue, even at the crashed price, would be $28,000. Her net profit would be just under $21,000. It was the best year of her life. The vindication came in a single quiet moment in November. It was the annual meeting of the Farmers Co-op. The mood was funereal. The manager was explaining the co-op's own financial distress, its exposure to the bad debts of its members. Men who had been driving new $60,000 pickups a year ago were sitting slumped in their chairs, their faces grey with worry. Elara sat in the back, as she always did. The manager put up a slide. It was an anonymous summary of the profitability of member farms for the year. It showed dozens of operations, identified only by a number. The bars on the graph all plunged deep into the red. Losses of $50,000. Losses of $100,000. Losses of $200,000. And then, at the very end of the chart, there was one thin, solitary bar that rose into the black. It was labeled Farm Number 73. It showed a net profit of $20,800 on 120 acres. A silence fell over the room. Everyone knew who Farm Number 73 was. Everyone in that room had, at some point, dismissed Elara Bishop as a backward relic. They had pitied her. They had laughed at her. Now, in the stark reality of a financial winter, her farm was the only green shoot in a field of brown. One by one, heads began to turn. Men who had not looked her in the eye for years turned in their seats to look at the small woman in the back of the room. They weren't looking with pity anymore. They were looking with a dawning, painful respect. They saw not a museum piece, but an ark. Leo was there. He was 20 now. He sat next to his aunt. He saw the chart and he saw the heads turning. For the first time, he understood. He understood the difference between the imaginary money on a spreadsheet and the real money in his aunt's ledger. He understood the wisdom in the 50-year-old seed bag, in the well-oiled harness, in the slow, steady pace of the horses. He felt a hot flush of shame for his earlier arguments, followed by a wave of immense pride. He reached over and quietly put his hand on his aunt's arm. She did not look at him, but she placed her hand over his. Let me tell you about the aftermath, because the consequences of a single season ripple for decades. In the 2 years following the crash of 2008, 3 more farms on Elara's road went into foreclosure. The corporate aggregator that bought Frank Miller's farm went bankrupt itself. The land was sold again, this time to an investment fund in California. Mark Renslow was let go from the bank in a round of layoffs. The last anyone heard, he was selling insurance in a suburb 200 miles away. His confident system, built on the assumption of stable growth and manageable variables, had shattered on contact with reality. Elara's farm became something of a quiet legend. Other farmers, younger ones who were just starting out and were wary of debt, started visiting her. They didn't come to talk about spreadsheets. They came to ask about crop rotation, about green manures, about how to fix a piece of old machinery. They came to watch her harness Jed and Maeve. Leo finished college with a degree in business, but he came home. He came home to the 120 acres. He spent the next 10 years as his aunt's apprentice. He learned to plow a straight furrow. He learned the feel of good soil. He learned how to mend leather and how to listen to the breathing of a horse. He learned the deep, slow rhythm of a system designed not for maximum profit, but for maximum resilience. He learned his great-grandfather's rules. Elara Bishop passed away in 2019 at the age of 69. She died as her grandfather had in her own home, looking out at the farm. She left it to Leo, free and clear. The farm had 0 debt. The soil organic matter was at 7.1%. On the day of her funeral, the small country church was overflowing. The pews were filled with the farmers of Lincoln County, men and women who had come to understand the lesson she had embodied. The story of Bishop Farm is not about rejecting technology. Elara had electricity. She owned a small pickup truck for trips to town and a baler run by a small gasoline engine. The story is about the difference between tools and systems. A tool serves the user. A system demands the user serve it. The tractor, the loan, the chemical package, that was a system. It promised efficiency, but it demanded obedience to a volatile, external logic of markets and global supply chains. The horses were a tool. They were powered by the farm itself, and their purpose was not to maximize yield in a single quarter, but to ensure the farm's survival over a century. What survives is not always the strongest, or the fastest, or the most profitable in any given year. What survives is what is most adaptable. The rigid system, optimized for one specific set of conditions, breaks when the conditions change. The resilient system, with its deep roots and its built-in redundancies, bends and endures. It sacrifices short-term spectacular gain for the certainty of long-term, quiet persistence. It was never about the fuel bill being 0. It was about the dependency being 0. That was the freedom her grandfather had purchased in 1946, and it was the inheritance she passed on, intact, to the next generation.